You know, my favorite thing is when they come up and they say, "Hey, are you that guy in Steely Dan?" And and you say, "Yeah," and they say, "No, you're not. You're not him." That's what I like.
Steely Dan is not a band. In fact, nobody's quite sure what exactly it is or was, beside being named after a notorious object from a William Burroughs novel. Look it up! The musical experiment was started by Donald Fagen and Walter Becker in 1972, a shared project after the collapse of their previous band, Leather Canary, which had Chevy Chase of all people on drums, in 1969. By 1980, the band, in quotation marks, had boiled down to Donald, Walter, and a select few producers, along with a lot of session musicians. By all regards, Fagen and Becker were Steely Dan, and Steely Dan was the two former students from Bard College. There is a reason for that. The pair shared both a taste in music and a, how do you say, habit of incredible anal retentiveness. Their music is love it or hate it depending on one's taste for overproduction. Steely Dan's albums have been called everything from slick to airless to soulless to almost mechanical. No surprise then the duo was one of the first groups to embrace digital production. The high watermark for the band's obsession with perfection came with Asia, a jazz rock fusion album considered one of the highest quality recordings ever released. Still, after the 1977 smash hit, Steely Dan, as perfectionists are wont to do, wanted to outdo themselves. In 1978, they returned to the studio with plans for Gaucho, the band's seventh album that would end the decade. End it in a few ways. Years later, Donald Fagen would call Gaucho an album of despair. Instead of emerging in '79, Gaucho lingered until the '80s. It took 14 long, troublesome months full of pain and toil to complete. The final product was a 37-minute long, 7-tracked wide, darkly cynical dirge for the cocaine-fueled '70s. Pretty much peak Steely Dan. But did it emerge, I mean? Who is the Gaucho Amigo? Because there's one we know, and one we do not. The production of Gaucho was infamously troubled. From the start, the album was met with legal complications. After completing Asia, the band attempted to leave their old bankrupt label, ABC, for Warner Brothers Music. In preparation, they moved from LA to NYC to record the forthcoming Gaucho. The issue was ABC was bought out by MCA, who claimed, due to their contract, Steely Dan owed them one more album, until it turned out ABC still owed Steely Dan millions in royalties. ABC brought the issue to MCA, MCA decided to pay out to the band, but claimed they were legally owed Gaucho. Steely Dan countered by saying they had fulfilled their contract. The dispute grew into a 2-year-long legal battle, one that eventually made it to the Supreme Court of California, where it was ruled the pair were owed their money, but they had to release one more record under MCA ABC after the acquisition. The decision dampened the spirits of the already discouraged Fagen and spiraling Becker. From the get-go, Gaucho was facing issues. In actual production, a major problem hit Gaucho right out the gate, one concerning the now infamous song, The Second Arrangement, a track considered by producers Gary Katz and Roger Nichols to be the best of the album. A classic 5-minute jazz tune focusing on the classic Steely Dan character of the gentleman loser. Gaucho being so plagued with issues, one can already imagine what happened. Though stories differ, the general agreement is a recording assistant accidentally destroyed the perfect take of the song, either by deleting it, erasing the tape, or recording calibration tones over the song. Either way, the final product was mostly lost. While Katz and Nichols attempted to recover it, only the 2-minute intro section could be salvaged, the best version that exists today. Another big setback which cost a lot of time and a lot of money. The two producers were forced to break the news to the duo. Upon hearing the loss of the song, Fagen left the studio without saying a word. He would later call it one of the most serious emotional setbacks we've ever had in the studio. He did return the next day with hopes to replicate the first take, but the damage was done. While spirits were still high in the studio, the band could just not reproduce the quality of the destroyed copy. Thousands of dollars were wasted in the attempt. By one accident, dozens of hours of work and effort had been lost. Unless you believe the theory that Fagen purposely destroyed the song to sabotage the album as to spite MCA, but we will get there. Still, the debacle left the Dan without a song, and they would soon be out an actual member. By the end of the '70s, Walter Becker had been struggling with a heroin habit for years. While the substance abuse had never impacted his work, it had begun to define his lifestyle, especially in a city like New York. It was a reliance that would soon have a heavy impact on his personal life. In January 1980, Becker's girlfriend died of a heroin overdose at his New York apartment. The unfortunate event sent Becker into a deep depression few believe he ever recovered from. Even then, the hardships were not over for him. The deceased girlfriend's family sued him for $17.5 million, claiming he had introduced the addiction to her. Becker and the family settled out of court for an unknown amount, but life would still hit him hard. Literally, as in inertia. 3 months later, in April 1980, Becker was struck by a New York cab stepping off a curb in Manhattan. The accident fractured his leg, landing him in the hospital for 6 months. As Becker was in the hospital, the duty of mixing the album fell to the Obsessive Fagen with the help of Gary Katz and Roger Nichols. Becker could only communicate with the group by phone, which was not much help, nor could he reel in Fagen. The consequences were expected. The immediate results found Fagen obsessing over drum sequences, mostly in Babylon Sisters. He spent hours debating over the drum beats in the song and cycling through multiple session musicians to complete it, none of whom could match his incredibly high standards. Even in editing, Fagen was unable to cut together a satisfactory song. Despite all the extra money flushed into the album, no human player could satisfy what the band desired for the song. Once Fagen's obsessiveness wore thin, Katz declared to Nichols, "Can't you make a fucking machine to make things perfect?" All Nichols asked for was $150,000 and time. 3 weeks later, he returned with Wendell, a computerized drum sequencer that, according to Fagen, took up 3 rooms, a rudimentary digital audio editing environment, though it often took 20 minutes to sequence a second-long drum beat. Despite Wendell's finicky nature, the machine was a major revolutionary component in Gaucho's production, being one of the main players behind the album's soundscape. Important enough, the machine even got a plaque when the album went platinum. As Wendell would later be regarded, even the most minute event had to be programmed in the gnarly and unforgiving 8085 assembly language, in which all relevant parameters needed to be described in its baffling hexadecimal-based numerical system, which ultimately became the only language Roger Nichols spoke or understood, at least for a time. Even with the drum machine's mechanical, pseudo-streamlined nature, it took a while for anything to match Fagen's own standards, including himself, even with Becker. Beside the dozens of hours each day spent editing, Fagen often hyper-fixated on exact sequences, the most infamous being the 50-second fade-out of Babylon Sisters. Not the song, the fade-out. It took 55 attempts for Fagen, Katz, and Nichols to come to an agreement over it. This was only one issue too, on the same song. Beyond the outro, Fagen crafted a legendary 250 mixes of Babylon Sisters, a song which had taken the drummer, Bernard Pretty Purdy, 2 takes to nail. After the 250th mix, the maintenance crew presented Donald with a floppy disk, painted silver with nail polish, as his platinum mix. By mix 274, he decided perhaps enough was enough, until he noticed the second bass note in the second bar was too soft. Even with extensive audio surgeries on each song, some of the planned tracks he and Fagen could not make work. The most notorious being the legendary Heartbreak Souvenir, one of the few Steely Dan outtakes to never surface in any form. Its existence is only confirmed because guitarist Steve Kahn certified it did exist. It was apparently thrown out as Fagen thought the pitch was too high for him to sing in, so the song was too hard to sing and was thrown out with the other Gaucho outtakes. Though, unlike the others, it is unknown if it was ever redone and rechristened with a new name. Not that Fagen did not apply these standards fairly. Steely Dan was often at odds with the New York musicians they hired for each song, most of whom Fagen and Becker considered unprepared compared to their Los Angeles counterparts. Most days consisted of hours-long, unbroken studio sessions until dinner, where they would break, then return to the studio. Nearly all these sessions consisted of, on average, 40 takes per musician, if not more, a grueling process for most. Mark Knopfler, lead guitarist of Dire Straits, played guitar on Time Out of Mind, 10 hours of recording which, in editing, was reduced to about a 15-second sequence in a 4-minute song. Knopfler compared the recording experience to getting in a swimming pool with lead weights tied to your boots, a sentiment that was pretty universally shared among musicians on Gaucho, the final songs being spliced together gestalts of what Fagen considered the best cuts from each musician, meaning even most full takes from Gaucho were excised from the album. Other songs were less fortunate. Gaucho's 14 months were littered with casualties, the most sought after being the now mythical Heartbreak Souvenir, a legendary piece of what was already considered a holy grail outtakes album. Unlike the rest of the songs from The Lost Gaucho, basically nothing, except Steve Kahn's testimony on it, has ever appeared. Other songs like Kule Baba have had demo versions emerge. For Kule Baba, 2 complete versions do exist, an up-tempo and a down-tempo version. The only major difference being on the up-tempo version, Fagen's voice can be heard between verses, directing the tech crew to pitch his voice. There are also a few slight differences in lyrics. The fast version states, "I hear there's a bash in Cameroon," while the slower one states, "I hear there's a bash in New Orleans." What is noticeable is how most of the songs sound nearly finished. Some are obviously demos, but the lyrics are still polished Steely Dan. "I Can't Write Home About You" even includes what I consider to be one of Steely Dan's best lines. "Bitch girls bring their money downtown to hear those cat house blues, thin men with $1.380. With the band's final say, Gaucho left a warpath of almost finished songs in the backlog, carrying that would one day be Frankenstein by fans into the bootleg Lost Gaucho. While a double album was likely considered at some point, it was doubtful either the injured Becker or exhausted Fagen had the willpower to continue. Even with the wealth of versions, Gaucho reached its final cut by 1980, a perfect end of the 70s, and then end of Steely Dan album. It released on November 21st, 1980. The 14 months took 42 studio musicians, 11 engineers, and nearly $1 million to complete. Still, due to the MCA acquisition, the album was not out of the woods or on the shelves yet. The studio decided to set the price for Gaucho at $9.98 for retail, a whole dollar higher than the then usual price of $8.98, making it the most expensive album ever sold in stores. Then, still, Gaucho went platinum and was pretty well regarded at the time, though less so than Asia. Unfortunately, the price controversy was what broke Steely Dan's back. While the group had been able to hold it together in the studio, the endless issues broke Fagen and Becker's desire to continue into the 80s. Becker later confessed, as the band broke it off until the early 90s, "Working together as long as we did, Donald and I followed a certain line of thinking to its logical conclusion, and then perhaps slightly beyond. That was what we realized when we finished Gaucho. It was not as much fun. It wasn't fun at all, really." Through the 80s and 90s, Fagen and Becker drifted apart to work on their own projects. No surprise then that once Becker left the hospital and cleaned up, he moved to Hawaii to become an avocado farmer. No, really, he did. Becker was always kind of mysterious like that. He did produce a few bands after, such as China Crisis, but he would not fully reemerge till 1993. Fagen had, meanwhile, actually signed to Warner Brothers for his debut album, The Nightfly, in 1982. This would commence Fagen's trilogy of The Nightfly, Kamakiriad in 1993, which I may do something on one day, and Morph the Cat in 2006. He would also help produce Becker's debut album in 1994, which would lead to Steely Dan's true reunion in 2000 with Two Against Nature, though Steely Dan still could not escape Gaucho. Jazz musician Keith Jarrett sued Steely Dan for supposedly stealing Gaucho's tune from his song Long As You Know You're Living Yours. Jarrett won and was awarded co-credit. Fagen later admitted he did draw inspiration from the song, but it was a devastating blow. After that, Gaucho's will seemed to be done. All that circulated then about these lost Gaucho tapes was a rumor for a good 20 years. That and poor quality recordings traded out of the trunks of cars. This did not stop word of mouth. What proliferated most was what Steve Kahn called the 4 great songs of the album: Heartbreak Souvenir, Second Arrangement, Kule Baba, and I Can't Write Home About You, all 3 of which were near completion before they were cut by executive decision. Their quality, according to Kahn, was good enough to have been included on a lesser band's release. Urban legend attributes their survival to a sneaky recording assistant, an assistant who illegally smuggled demo copies out of the studio on cassette after the crew had left. It was likely the guy who was meant to add the horns, which is why so many of the leaked demo copies lack them. That is also why so much content was preserved from Gaucho. Low-quality copies circulated on the bootleg trade for most of the 80s and 90s, though their production on these tape copies was apparently remarkably poor. By the 2000s, far better quality recordings emerged online. Then, in the 2010s, Steely Dan enthusiasts had pseudo-restored most of the songs to hypothetical completion. Though, as no official release has ever occurred, these rarities remain curiosities shoved to the back of the band's catalog, as, due to Gaucho's production, better quality versions are unlikely to still exist locked away somewhere. Also, due to poor handling, many of the Steely Dan masters have decayed or been destroyed due to neglect. In my opinion, though, the lo-fi, incomplete nature gives the Lost Gaucho a unique identity, especially as obscure material from a band known for absolute fidelity and quality. Compared to Gaucho, Lost Gaucho sounds far more upbeat if still as cynical and materialistic, perhaps reflecting the exterior struggles the band faced during production. Gaucho, as it exists now, is the band's final version birthed from the troubled production process. The Lost Gaucho reflects the more optimistic and complex version Fagen and Becker had at the start. Two mirror images to Asia. So how real is this Lost Gaucho, or as it is sometimes known, Foxcho then? Well, it is real enough to have a Genius page, though an incomplete one. Like any bootleg album, it is an interesting example of what could have been, perhaps even more so for Gaucho, as some consider the bootleg the true version of the album, or Steely Dan's original vision for Gaucho, as some believe the actual release of Gaucho was the intentionally inferior version of the album released to spite MCA. Claims Fagen himself interfered to purposefully delete the second arrangement, though any actual proof for this theory is non-existent beside a few differences between accounts of the second arrangement debacle. It is clear the removed songs were simply natural casualties. What is actually original to the Lost Gaucho is debated, as the official-unofficial release is a bootleg album. Song listings often vary in order and inclusion, some songs even being outtakes from Asia. Most versions of the Outtakes album then run about 47 minutes depending, though Ed Von M's upload on YouTube, a different cut featuring some added rougher and earlier versions of the demos, goes up to 1 hour 37 minutes. Point is, there is more than enough material to fill an entire album, one that actually runs longer than the original Gaucho, though it is far less polished. A sort of shadow companion to the original then. Even the common cover art for the Gaucho Outtakes is meant to play to the original cover, which features Argentine artist Israel Hoffman's Old Guard Tango. The original Gaucho was obviously heavily pared down in editing. Perhaps Steely Dan, like with Asia, wanted an only cream of the crop album. But in other ways, Gaucho is nothing like Asia. It is a far colder and removed sounding album, the songs more subtly complex and, somehow, more cynical, the low to Asia's high, an end of the 70s audio decadence, the pinpoint hangover to Asia's experimental debauchery. If Asia is a cocaine fantasy, then Gaucho is the hard reality which hits afterwards. For Steely Dan and the album's hectic production, this was an intended theme. What about the songs then? What makes the Lost Gaucho so remarkable for a bootleg? Most versions of it run 8 songs, but it varies with some songs actually being cut from Asia. Kind Spirit is a classic Steely Dan song of a codependent relationship gone wrong. Maybe. The lyrics to it are incomplete. There's a lot of riffing and na 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 na. Not much to say on it. Kuli Baba, which means Dance of Ancestors in Swahili, and it was only found out when a Steely Dan fan contacted a company named Kuli Baba in Texas, I think, run by a brother and sister whose parents were from Africa. Turns out Fagen and Becker somehow knew the Swahili or read it somewhere. It has 2 versions, a more complete upbeat version and a rougher, slower, earlier cut. Both are basically the same. It is a parody of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom or other such programs about Westerners descending upon a tribal ritual they barely understand.
Word with my chief engineer. We'll mix with the mob for all the folks at home. I'm tasting the loaf beer, and half the crew is dancing in the foam.
The cocky show host goes by McSwain or McSween and has a suit of Irish green.
My nom de voyage McSween. I carry the proper papers. I seek the primal rhythms of the bush. I preserve great moments as they come, and sure this must be one.
Sounds basically complete. Sad it was never released. The Bear, or sometimes If You Got the Bear, is perhaps the most unique bootleg as it has actually been played live by Steely Dan, though never officially released. This puts it in a very rare, rarities category, being performed in 2011, or about 30 years after it was actually recorded. Becker even referenced the opening lines of the Lost track in his own song down in the bottom, with the phrase, "If I got the bear, or if the bear got me."
But only time will tell if you got the bear, or the bear.
Production-wise, pretty solid. It is about drug smuggling and what goes wrong when the runner tastes the product.
Sir, I parked my juggernaut at your gate. 15,000 miles and I'm feeling great. I've been on the run, but I done my time. You just can't stand still with a friend like mine.
That's when the bear gets you. Talking About My Home is what I consider the weakest cut. Though it is in no way bad, it has vaguely science fiction lyrics, which suggest it is a very, very early seed for Fagen's later Kamakiriad, with the intro even sounding vaguely like the later song On the Dunes.
I was born and raised and lived and loved and died today. But when I saw the lights, my word was here.
Not bad, but noticeably rough. Middling. Can't Write Home About You is definitely my personal favorite Lost Gaucho track, if it even is from Gaucho, simply for the line,
Rich girls bring their money downtown to hear those cat house blues. Thin men with $1.380 more than nothing to lose.
The more jaunty flow of the song makes me think it's actually from Asia or earlier, sardonic with a good beat that screams Steely Dan at peak performance. Awful it was never released on, or later redone for, a later album. Gin and Roses. The Notorious second arrangement. It's good. Really good, actually. Even the incomplete demo is as good as Katz and Nichols apparently thought it was. An actual crime did not make the cut, and I do wonder how excellent the destroyed version was. We at least have several demo varieties, the original 2-minute intro, and a slew of fan recreations. Some madman even went and remastered the second demo.
Just one red rose and a tender goodbye. One last goodbye. Then I run to the second arrangement. It's only the natural thing. A rule stepped out with no regrets. A sparkling conscience, a new address.
Had it been released, I do think the second arrangement could have been a hit. Perhaps, even by its own inclusion, inching Gaucho above Asia in popular standing. It's the classic Steely Dan scenario of a gentleman loser, layabout seducer attempting to drink his way through life. Even if you do not like Steely Dan, you absolute beast who listened through the last 6 pages of this script, I recommend everyone give it a listen. It is perhaps the worst sacrifice made to bring Gaucho to fruition. The last one is a bit odd, as it was a last-minute replacement for the second arrangement. Were You Blind That Day was actually an outtake from Asia, a song deemed too dark by Steely Dan. Steely Dan. It mentions guns, slaves, and blindness as the hangman took them all. I think it's about the American Civil War, but nobody is sure. It does have Larry Carlton on guitar, though. It was rewritten, remixed, and re-edited into Third World Man, which is either about child soldiers, PTSD, or both. So, as you can see, they made it much happier, but still, an oddly appropriate end to Gaucho. By the End of the Road, Kind Spirit, The Bear, the second arrangement, Talking About My Home, I Can't Write Home About You, and Coolie Baba were excised from Gaucho, though some may have been from Asia. These 6 are generally seen as the core of the lost Gaucho, as they were the ones most commonly circulated on the bootleg tapes and online today branded outtakes from Gaucho. While Babylon Sisters, Hey 19, Glamour Profession, and My Rival were all added to Gaucho, all worthy additions. Well, Were You Blind That Day was re-edited to Third World Man, Time Out of Mind was slightly remixed into its featured condition, and the title track, Gaucho, had some subtle drum changes in its final version, meaning these 3 stand out as being slightly altered, but beside Third World Man, they have no interesting backstories. And, with Gaucho, we come to the end of the labyrinthian custardome that is the Lost Gaucho. That is it in its often agreed upon entirety. Is it actually a better album than Gaucho, though? That comes up to personal opinion. As someone who likes Steely Dan, I like both in their own way, but I think I can appreciate the lost Gaucho more for the fact it survives at all, incomplete or not. The same allure of Forbidden Knowledge. It is, after all, the album that killed Steely Dan. For a 20-year period, anyway. Gaucho is a lot of sweat, the lost Gaucho is a lot of blood, and the entire Odyssey a lot of tears. It is fair to Steely Dan fans both should be known. The creation of an interesting audio dualism. Who then is the Gaucho amigo? Well, you better ask him why he's standing in your spangled leather poncho and elevator shoes, because, in actuality, there are two Gauchos. Both bodacious cocaine cowboys of the 70s boom and bust. They both got a steely glint in their eyes, too. So just sing that Ghana Rondo.
Well, let's look at it this way. Suppose the bass was a hooker, right?
Exactly.
Let's say you got a $1,000 a night hooker
Right.
versus a $100 a night hooker, right? The $100 a night hooker has what? A heart of gold, right? So
That's
which
true.
one, you know?
Which one do you take home, the mother?
Yeah, one chocolate banana shake.